Hey again, crew. It's good to see you. Today we're on chapter 14 of Mr. Popper's Penguins. Now, if you remember, Mr. Popper now has Captain Cook. Greta was given to them by a museum who was worried about Greta. And so they have those two penguins. And then Greta started laying eggs. In fact, she laid one egg every 3 days. And now they have 10. 12 penguins. Yeah, 12 penguins, because she laid 10 eggs. So there's 12 penguins now that they have. And the issue was, how will we feed all of them? So they were trying to figure out how to make some money, because they had a lot of expenses from ice machines and all this other kind of stuff, from the fish food and the shrimp, and then the real fish they were bringing in. So they need to make some money. So Mr. Popper has an idea. Do you remember what the idea was? Yeah. The idea was they are going to turn it into a show. And they've been practicing making it into a show. Mrs. Popper with her gloves on, playing the piano, and them having the penguins do all kinds of different types of things for their act. So, kind of cool. All right, so let's see what comes of this, because they're hoping to make some money through this, but you got to get people to want to see this. So chapter 14 is called Mr. Greenbaum. Look here, said Mr. Popper at breakfast one morning. It says here in the Morning Chronicle that Mr. Greenbaum, the owner of that Palace Theater, is in town. He's got a string of theaters all over the country, so I guess we'd better go down and see him. Now, remember what we said about these theaters. These aren't movie theaters. These are like stage theaters, like the Capitol Theater in Aberdeen. It's got a big stage on it and stuff. So Mr. Greenbaum owns a lot of these. Kind of like in Aberdeen, we have AMC theaters. Well, if you go to around the country to different cities and places, you might find AMC theaters elsewhere. Or if you were to go to McDonald's. McDonald's isn't just in Aberdeen. There are McDonald's all over the place. So Mr. Greenbaum kind of owns his own theater chain. And they're all over the country, okay? So they're hoping that if he likes their act, maybe he'll send them to his theaters. They can make some money that way. So that evening, it was Saturday, the 29th of January, the Popper family and their 12 trained penguins, 2 of them carrying flags in their beaks, left the house to find the Palace Theater. The penguins were now so well trained that Mr. Popper decided that it was not necessary to keep them on leashes. Indeed, they walked to the bus line very nicely in the following line of march. Mr. Popper, Greta, Captain Cook, Columbus and Victoria, Mrs. Popper, Nelson and Jenny, Magellan and Adelina, Billy and Janie Popper, Scott and Isabella, and Ferdinand and Louisa at the end. The bus stopped at the corner, and before the astonished driver could protest, they had all climbed on the bus, and the bus was on its way. Do I pay half fare for the birds, or do they go free? Asked Mr. Popper. Janie goes half fare, but I'm 10, said Bill. Hush, said Mrs. Popper, as she and the children found their seats. The penguins followed in an orderly fashion. Say, mister, said the driver, where do you think you're going with that exhibit? Downtown, said Mr. Popper. Here, let's call it 50 cents and let it go at that. To tell the truth, I lost count when they went past me, said the driver. It's a trained penguin act, said Mr. Popper. Are they really birds? Asked the driver. Oh, yes, said Mr. Popper. I'm just taking them down to the palace to interview Mr. Greenbaum, the big theater owner. Well, if I hear any complaints, off they go at the next corner, said the driver. Fair enough, said Mr. Popper, who wanted to ask for transfers in that case, but decided to let well enough alone. The penguins were behaving very well. They were sitting quietly, 2 in a seat, while the other passengers looked on. Sorry, said Mr. Popper, addressing everyone in the bus, but I'll have to open all the windows. These are Antarctic penguins, and they're used to having it a lot colder than this. It took Mr. Popper quite a while to open the windows, which were stuck fast. When he had succeeded, there were plenty of remarks from the other passengers. Many of them began to complain to the driver, who told Mr. Popper to take his birds off the bus. He had to repeat this several times. Finally, he refused to take the bus any further until Mr. Popper got off. By this time, however, the bus had got so far downtown that none of them minded having to get out into the street. Does this remind you of another book that we read? Was there another book where somebody took a pet on the bus and he really wasn't supposed to and it caused a lot of troubles? Yeah, Henry Huggins, right? When he took Ribsy on the bus and the bus driver says, "Hey, Sonny, you can't take that dog on the bus." And then Henry kind of made it so that Ribsy could get on the bus in the bag, and then it caused a huge mess. And Henry had to go home with the police. Yeah, not quite exactly what happened here. They were able to get almost where they're going. Now they're off the bus and they have to walk. Only a block ahead of them shone the lights of the Palace Theater. "Hello," said the theater manager as the Poppers and the Penguins trooped past him. "Sure, Mr. Greenbaum's in here in my office. You know, I've heard about these birds of yours, but I didn't really believe it. Mr. Greenbaum, meet the Popper Penguins. I'll be leaving you. I've got to go backstage." The Penguins, now standing politely in 2 rows of 6 each, looked curiously at Mr. Greenbaum. Their 24 white-circled eyes were very solemn. "All you people crowding around the door, go back to where you belong," said Mr. Greenbaum. "This is a private conference." And he got up to shut the door. The Popper sat down while Mr. Greenbaum walked up and down the double row of penguins, looking them over. "Well, it looks like an act," he said. "Oh, it's an act, all right," said Mr. Popper. "It's Poppers Performing Penguins. First time on any stage, direct from the South Pole." He and Mrs. Popper had thought up this name for their act. "Could we call them Popper's Pink-Toed Penguins?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper thought for a moment. "No," he said, "I'm afraid we couldn't. That sounds too much like chorus girls or ballet dancers, and these birds are pretty serious. I don't think they'd like it." "All right," said Mr. Greenbaum. "Show me the act." "There's music to it," said Janie. "Mama plays the piano." "Is that true, madam?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Yes, sir," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well, there's a piano behind you," said Mr. Greenbaum. "You may begin, madam. I want to see this act. If it's any good, you people have come to the right place. I've got theaters from coast to coast. But first, let's see your penguins perform. Ready, ma'am?" "We'd better move the furniture first," said Bill. Chapter 15. Poppers Performing Penguins. At that moment, they were interrupted by the manager, who came in with a groan. "What's the matter?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "The marvelous Marcos, who's closed the program, they haven't turned up yet, and the audience are demanding their money back." "Well, what are you going to do?" asked Mr. Greenbaum. "Give it to them, I suppose. And here it is Saturday night, the biggest night of the week. I hate to think of losing all that money." "I have an idea," said Mr. Popper, or Mrs. Popper. "Maybe you won't have to lose it. As long as it's the end of the program, why don't we just have the penguins rehearse in there on a real stage? We'd have more room, and I think the audience would enjoy it." "All right," said the manager. "Let's try it." So the penguins had their first real rehearsal on a real stage. The manager stepped out on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his hand, "with your kind indulgence, we're going to try out a little novelty number tonight. Owing to unforeseen circumstances, the marvelous Marcos were unable to appear. We're going to let you see a rehearsal of the Popper Performing Penguins instead. Thank you." In a dignified way, the Poppers and the Penguins walked out on the stage, and Mrs. Popper sat down at the piano. "Aren't you going to take your gloves off to play?" asked the manager. "Oh, no," said Mrs. Popper. "I'm so used to playing with them that I'll keep them on if you don't mind." Then she started Schubert's Military March. The penguins began to drill very nicely, wheeling and changing in formations with great precision, until Mrs. Popper stopped playing in the middle of the piece. The audience clapped vigorously. "There's more to it," explained Mrs. Popper, half to the manager and half to the audience, "where they form in a hollow square and march in that formation. It's so late, we'll skip that number tonight and jump to the next part." "You're sure you don't want to take your gloves off, ma'am?" asked the manager. Mrs. Popper smilingly shook her head and began the Merry Widow Waltz. 10 of the penguins now formed in a semicircle as Nelson and Columbus in their midst put on a wild sparring contest. Their round black beaks leaned back far so that they could watch each other with both round white eyes. "York," said Nelson, punching Columbus in the stomach with his right flipper and then trying to push him over with his left flipper. "Yaw," said Columbus, going into a clinch and hanging his head over Nelson's shoulder as he tried to punch him in the back. "Hey, no fair," said the manager. Columbus and Nelson broke loose as the other 10 penguins looking on applauded with their flippers. Columbus now sparred politely with Nelson until Nelson hit him in the eye, whereupon Columbus retreated with a loud "Ork!" The other penguins began to clap, and the audience joined them. As Mrs. Popper finished the waltz, both Nelson and Columbus stopped fighting, put down their flippers, and stood still, facing each other. "Which word won? Which one won? Who's ahead?" shouted the audience. "Look," said all the 10 penguins in the semicircle. This must have meant look, for Nelson turned to look at them, and Columbus immediately punched him in the stomach with one flipper and knocked him down with the other. Nelson lay there with his eyes closed. Columbus then counted 10 over the prostrate Nelson, and again the 10 other penguins applauded. "That's part of the act," explained Janie. "The other penguins all like Columbus to win, and so they all say 'Gook' at the end. That also makes Nelson look away so Columbus can sock him." Nelson now rose to his feet, and all the penguins formed in a row and bowed to the manager. "Thank you," said the manager, bowing back. "Now comes part 3, said Mr. Popper. "Oh, Papa," said Mrs. Popper, "you forgot to bring the 2 painting step ladders and the board." "Well, that's all right," said the manager. "I'll get the stagehands to bring some." In no time at all, a pair of ladders and a board were brought in, and Mr. Popper and the children showed them how the ladders had to be set up with the board resting on top. Then Mrs. Popper began playing the pretty descriptive piece, "By the Brook." At this point in the act, the penguins always forgot their discipline and got dreadfully excited. They would all begin shoving at once to see which would be the first to climb the ladders. However, the children had always told Mr. Popper that the act was all the funnier for this pushing and scrambling, and Mr. Popper supposed it was. So now, with a great deal of squawking, the penguins fought and climbed the ladders and ran across the board in complete confusion, often knocking each other entirely off to the floor below, and then hurrying to toboggan down the other ladder and knock off any penguins who were trying to climb up there. This part of the act was very wild and noisy, in spite of Mrs. Popper's delicate music. The manager and the audience were all holding their sides, laughing. At last, Mrs. Popper got to the end of the music and took off her gloves. "You'll have to get those ladders off the stage, or I'll never get those birds under control," said Mr. Popper. "The curtain is supposed to fall at this point." So the manager gave the signal for the curtain to go down, and the audience stood up and clapped. They cheered. When the ladders had been taken away, the manager had 12 ice cream cones brought in for the penguins. Then Janie and Bill asked for some too, so the manager ordered several more, and everybody had one. Mr. Greenbaum was the first to congratulate the Poppers. "I don't mind telling you, Mr. Popper, that I think you've got something absolutely unique in those birds. Your act is a sensation. And the way you helped out my friend the manager here shows that you're real troopers, the kind we need in show business. I'd like to predict that your penguins will soon be packing the biggest theaters in Oregon to Maine. And now, to come to terms, Mr. Popper," he continued, "how about a 10-week contract at $5,000 a week?" "Is that all right, Mama?" asked Mr. Popper. "That's very satisfactory," answered Mrs. Popper. "Well then," said Mr. Greenbaum, "just sign these papers and be ready to open next Thursday in Seattle." "And thanks again," said the manager. "Would you mind putting on your gloves again for just a minute, Mrs. Popper? I'd like you to start playing that military march again and let the penguins parade for a minute. I want to get my ushers in here to look at those birds. It would be a lesson for them." And we'll stop there. Now, the penguins did a nice job. They put on a good act, and they were able to help out the theater manager, which Mr. Greenbaum was very impressed by. So now he's going to offer them a contract. Now let's think this through. He says he's going to give them a 10-week contract, and it's January. So 10 weeks will take them. There's 4 weeks in February, 4 weeks in March, and 4 weeks in April. So that's 4, 8, 12. Okay? So this contract is going to keep them out of their house from February through to the middle of April, which is where we kind of are right now, right? Now, they're going to be traveling all this time. That's going to be a long time for Janie and Bill to be away from home and away from school, for Mrs. Popper to be away from some of her things. But is this a big deal for Mr. Popper right now? Not really. He doesn't have anything else going on. Here's the other thing. 10 weeks, $5,000 a week. Let's count by fives. 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50. So 50 means that at $5,000, 10 weeks means they're going to make $50,000. Now, that is quite a bit of money for 10 weeks, even today. But remember, this is 1938, where things are a lot cheaper. Remember what he paid the serviceman? $5 to fix the refrigerator? I wish it cost $5 to get something fixed in your house. It doesn't. But here's the thing. $5,000 a week, $50,000. Is this going to help them out? Yeah. In $1938, this is going to help them out a lot. But they're going to have to do a lot of work to get there. And that's what the next chapter is called, On the Road. Because where are they starting? Seattle, which is way out west in Washington State. And then they're going to travel across the country until they get to Maine, which is on the complete opposite side of the United States. So, some traveling, some work to do, but they found a way to make some money. And now they are poppers performing penguins. And they're on the road. All right, catch you later.